Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories like this one. Now, let's begin. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, but everyone who knows me calls me Tank. I have been driving the ice roads of Alaska for over 15 years now, and let me tell you something about this job that most people do not understand. This is not just truck driving. This is survival driving. Every single mile of these frozen highways is a test against nature itself, where one wrong move, one moment of inattention, one mechanical failure can mean the difference between making it home to your family or becoming another statistic, buried under tons of ice and snow. I started this career when I was 28 years old, fresh out of a messy divorce in Phoenix, Arizona. I needed to get as far away from my old life as possible, and Alaska seemed like the perfect escape. The ice road companies were always looking for drivers willing to take the risks that came with hauling vital supplies to remote locations during the harshest months of the year. The pay was excellent, but the mortality rate was something they did not advertise in the recruitment brochures. In my first year alone, I witnessed 3 separate accidents that claimed the lives of experienced drivers who had been running these roads longer than I had been alive. The Dalton Highway, also known as the Haul Road, stretches for over 400 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the North American continent. During winter months, temperatures regularly drop to 40 below zero, and that is before you factor in the wind chill that can make it feel like 60 or 70 below. The road itself is basically a sheet of ice covering gravel, winding through mountain passes and across frozen rivers with drop-offs that plunge thousands of feet into rocky gorges, where recovery of vehicles or bodies is often impossible. But here is what keeps me coming back year after year, despite the constant danger and isolation. There is something pure about being out there, in that vast wilderness, just you and your rig against the elements. No traffic lights, no city noise, no complications of modern life. Just the steady rumble of a diesel engine, the crunch of tires on packed snow, and the endless expanse of white stretching out in every direction. At least that was how I felt about it until the night that changed everything. It was late November of last year, and I was making my 3rd run of the season up to Prudhoe Bay. The weather forecast had been calling for heavy snow, but nothing I had not handled dozens of times before. I was hauling a full load of propane tanks, destined for one of the remote drilling operations near the Arctic Ocean. The cargo was valuable, the deadline was tight, and the bonus for on-time delivery was substantial enough to make the risk worthwhile. I left Fairbanks just after midnight, planning to take advantage of the lighter traffic during the overnight hours. The first few hours went smoothly enough. The snow was falling steadily but not heavily, and the road conditions were about what I expected for late November. My CB radio was picking up occasional chatter from other drivers ahead of me and behind me. The usual mix of weather reports, road condition updates, and the kind of crude humor that helps pass the time on long hauls. By the time I reached the Yukon River crossing, the weather had taken a serious turn for the worse. What had started as light snow had developed into a full-blown whiteout, with visibility dropping to less than 20 feet in front of my headlights. The wind was picking up too, creating that disorienting swirling effect that can make you lose all sense of direction, even when you are following a road you have traveled hundreds of times before. I had been driving for about 6 hours when I first spotted him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me through the swirling snow, but as I got closer, there was no mistaking it. A lone figure was standing at the side of the road, arm extended with his thumb up in the universal hitchhiker position. Now, picking up hitchhikers on the ice roads is something that just is not done. The risks are too great, the liability issues too complicated, and frankly, anyone crazy enough to be out walking in these conditions probably was not someone you wanted in your cab. But something about this particular situation bothered me. The figure was not dressed appropriately for the weather conditions. He was wearing what looked like a light jacket, no hat, no gloves that I could see. In these temperatures, he should have been dead from exposure within minutes. Yet there he stood, apparently unaffected by the brutal cold that was making even my heated cab feel inadequate. Against my better judgment, I started slowing down. Maybe it was the ingrained human instinct to help someone in distress, or maybe it was just curiosity about how anyone could survive out there so underdressed. Whatever the reason, I brought my rig to a stop about 10 feet past where he was standing and waited to see what would happen. The man approached the passenger side of the cab with measured, unhurried steps. Even through the blowing snow, I could see that his movements were strange, almost mechanical, lacking the urgency you would expect from someone who had been standing in sub-zero temperatures. When he reached the door, he knocked twice, a soft sound that somehow carried clearly over the howling wind. I rolled down the window just enough to talk to him. "Where are you headed?" I called out, having to raise my voice to be heard over the storm. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if he was listening to something I could not hear. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and calm, with no trace of the chattering teeth or labored breathing you would expect from someone suffering from cold exposure. "North," was all he said. That should have been my first real warning that something was not right about this situation. No one gives such a vague answer when they are asking for help in life-threatening conditions. But the storm was getting worse by the minute, and the longer I sat there with the window open, the more heat I was losing from the cab. I made a decision that I would regret for the rest of my life. "Get in," I told him. He climbed into the passenger seat with fluid movements that seemed too graceful for someone who should have been half frozen. As soon as he settled in, and I got my first good look at him in the cab lights, I felt an immediate sense of unease that I could not quite explain. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were a washed out blue that seemed to lack any real depth or warmth. But it was more than just his physical appearance that bothered me. There was something about his presence that made the air in the cab feel heavy and oppressive, like the atmosphere before a severe thunderstorm. I tried to make conversation as we got back on the road, asking him the usual questions about where he had come from, how long he had been waiting, whether he was okay. He responded to none of my attempts at small talk, just sat there staring straight ahead through the windshield with that unsettling blank expression. The only time he moved was to occasionally turn his head and look directly at me with those pale eyes, studying me in a way that made my skin crawl. As the hours passed and we pushed deeper into the wilderness, the storm continued to intensify. The CB radio, which had been crackling with intermittent communications earlier in the evening, had gone completely silent. Even the static seemed muted, as if the storm was somehow interfering with radio transmissions in ways I had never experienced before. The isolation was becoming complete, and with my strange passenger sitting beside me in absolute silence, the atmosphere in the cab was growing increasingly tense. It was somewhere around the Arctic Circle marker that things started to get truly strange. The man, who had not spoken a word since he'd gotten into the truck, suddenly turned to me and said, "You are not safe here." The sound of his voice after hours of silence was so unexpected that I actually jumped in my seat. But it was not just the surprise of him speaking that startled me. His voice had a hollow quality to it, like an echo coming from a great distance, and the words themselves sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing sense of dread that was building in my chest. Instead of answering my question, he raised one pale hand and pointed toward the passenger's side window. "Look," he said simply. I glanced over and immediately slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering against my ribs. There, moving through the trees parallel to the road, were dark shapes that should not have been there. They were too large to be wolves or bears, and they moved with a deliberate purpose that suggested intelligence rather than animal instinct. As I watched, one of the shapes broke from the tree line and crossed the road directly in front of my headlights, moving so quickly that I only caught a glimpse of something that looked almost human, but wrong in ways that my brain could not quite process. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, but when I turned to look at my passenger, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if he had never been there at all. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting there. No residual body heat, no impression in the seat cushion, nothing. I was alone in the cab, alone on the road, alone in the storm, with whatever those things were moving through the darkness around me. I did not stop to investigate. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and got out of there as fast as the road conditions would allow, my hand shaking so badly that I could barely keep the steering wheel steady. For the next 2 hours, I drove in a state of controlled panic, constantly checking my mirrors for signs of pursuit and jumping at every shadow that moved at the edge of my headlight beams. When I finally reached the safety of the truck stop at Dead Horse, I sat in my cab for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I told myself that it had to be hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and the stress of driving in severe weather conditions, but deep down, I knew that what I had experienced was real. Over the following months, I encountered the pale-eyed hitchhiker 3 more times, always under similar conditions of severe weather and poor visibility. Each time, he would appear at the roadside, climb into my cab without explanation, sit in silence for hours, and then vanish without a trace just before something inexplicable would happen. Other drivers I spoke with had similar stories, describing the same figure, the same pale eyes, the same unsettling presence. I still drive the ice roads because this job is all I know, and Alaska is my home now. But I never pick up hitchhikers anymore, no matter how desperate their situation might appear. Some roads are more than just paths from one place to another. Some roads are doorways to places that should remain closed. And some passengers are not looking for rides to earthly destinations. If you ever find yourself driving the Dalton Highway in winter, and you see a pale-eyed man standing at the roadside, do not stop. Keep driving, and do not look back. Trust me on this. Some help is not worth giving, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. My name is Dr. Rebecca Thompson. I am a wildlife biologist specializing in large mammal ecology, and for the past decade, I have dedicated my life to studying the majestic creatures that inhabit the vast wilderness of Alaska. I earned my doctorate from the University of Montana with a dissertation on predator-prey relationships in Arctic ecosystems, and I work primarily in Denali National Park, a place of breathtaking beauty but also of deep, ancient secrets. I pride myself on using science, logic, and rigorous observation to unravel the mysteries of animal behavior in what many would call the last true frontier. But sometimes, even the most rigorous scientific methodology cannot explain what is witnessed in the shadows of the deep wilderness. Our research team had planned an extended field expedition deep into Denali, approximately 40 miles from the established ranger stations, and well beyond the tourist trails that most visitors never venture past. The primary objective was to study the seasonal migration patterns of a particular caribou population that appeared to be affected by recent changes in vegetation patterns and shifting climate conditions. We had spent months securing the proper permits, acquiring the best cold weather gear available, and assembling equipment ranging from motion-activated remote cameras and GPS tracking collars to enough food supplies and scientific instruments to sustain our work for 3 full weeks in complete isolation. The expedition team consisted of 4 carefully selected individuals. There was myself as the project leader, Dr. Marcus Hale, a fellow biologist specializing in large carnivore behavior patterns, Sarah Lopez, a promising graduate student from Alaska Pacific University who was eager to contribute meaningful fieldwork to her thesis research, and James O'Connor, our seasoned park guide, whose knowledge of the remote backcountry areas was absolutely essential for navigating the challenging terrain safely. The first few days of our expedition were everything we had hoped they would be. Crystal clear skies stretched endlessly above us. Temperatures remained relatively mild for the season, and the landscape around us was gloriously alive with the calls of migrating birds and the constant rustle of small mammals moving through the dense underbrush. We had developed a strict daily routine of surveying predetermined transects, collecting soil and vegetation samples, and strategically positioning our monitoring equipment along known animal corridors. The thrill of being completely surrounded by raw, untouched nature energized all of us. We marveled at the incredible resilience of life flourishing in such harsh environmental conditions and felt genuinely fortunate to witness some of the last truly great wilderness remaining on Earth. But routine, no matter how comforting or methodical, has a disturbing habit of being shattered without warning. On the fourth day of our expedition, as we set out to place additional remote monitoring devices near a river crossing that was frequently utilized by moose and caribou herds, the entire atmosphere of the wilderness began to shift in ways that defied scientific explanation. The air grew unnaturally heavy and oppressive, almost thick enough to feel against our skin, and a persistent low fog started rolling in from the southern valleys. The forest, which had been vibrant with the constant chatter of wildlife and bird calls, fell into an ominous silence that seemed to press against our eardrums. Even the usual sound of wind moving through the towering spruce and birch trees became muted and distant. I felt an inexplicable tension building in my chest, accompanied by the unsettling sense that the woods themselves were holding their collective breath. Our progress slowed considerably as the fog thickened and reduced our visibility to just a few feet in any direction. James, our experienced guide, suddenly signaled for us to halt as he carefully scanned the dim clearing that lay ahead of us. His usually stoic demeanor was replaced by visible tension, his jaw clenched tight and his eyes narrowing as they darted between the shadowy trees. "I do not like this situation," he whispered, his voice low and filled with unmistakable concern. "We are not alone out here." A cold shiver shot down my spine, and I found myself glancing around uneasily at the fog-shrouded forest surrounding us. Then, emanating from somewhere deep within the mist-covered woods, we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate through the very earth beneath our boots. Unlike any predator vocalization I had ever encountered in my years of field research, this sound vibrated through the ground itself, carrying with it something primal and filled with raw, ancient hatred. Our trained scientific minds struggled desperately against the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm our rational thinking. Marcus immediately took the rifle from my hands, a clear indication that none of us felt remotely safe in this situation. We instinctively formed a tight defensive circle and began scanning the dense forest in every possible direction, every one of our senses heightened to maximum alert status. Then, emerging slowly from the thick mist, like something from a nightmare, we saw a form that defied all biological classification. It was difficult to discern specific details through the swirling fog, but the creature moved with an unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. This was definitely not an ordinary animal of any known species. The thing appeared twisted and vaguely humanoid in shape, covered entirely in matted, filthy fur, with limbs that bent at angles that violated every principle of mammalian anatomy. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, which glowed with an unnatural luminescence as they locked directly onto our small group with an intelligence that was unmistakably malevolent. Over the next hour, the hostile presence surrounding our position became increasingly aggressive and threatening. We could hear massive branches snapping in the distance, accompanied by the harsh echoes of otherworldly howls that suggested we were dealing with more than just a single creature. Following James's urgent guidance, we retreated as cautiously as possible toward a rocky outcropping that overlooked the rushing river below. Here, the elevated terrain offered some tactical advantage, and we quickly established a campfire to help hold back the encroaching darkness. that seemed to be pressing in from all sides. But the long night ahead proved to be anything but restful. Sleep completely evaded us, as every flicker of our campfire cast monstrous shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. Sarah gripped her research notebook tightly against her chest, whispering fragmented prayers under her breath as violent chills racked her entire body. Marcus maintained a steady, vigilant watch throughout the night, his rifle consistently trained on the dark tree line, while James paced tirelessly around our small perimeter, constantly scanning for any signs of movement in the impenetrable darkness beyond our firelight. When dawn finally arrived, it revealed grim evidence of the night's supernatural visitation. Several of our expensive remote cameras lay completely smashed among the underbrush, their metal casings twisted beyond recognition. The GPS tracking collars from several previously tagged caribou had been torn to shreds, their electronic components scattered across the forest floor. Most disturbing of all, there were no animal carcasses or traces of blood anywhere in the vicinity. Just the destroyed equipment left behind like calling cards from an invisible predator. The message was unmistakable. Whatever these creatures were, they were not only hunting the local wildlife, but had specifically targeted our research team for reasons we could not begin to comprehend. Despite the obvious and escalating danger, our scientific determination to collect meaningful data pushed us to continue deeper into what was clearly forbidden territory. The following day, we moved toward a series of cave entrances that James had previously marked on our topographical maps, locations that he mentioned were steeped in indigenous legends and carried whispered warnings from local native communities about disturbing ancient resting places. Upon entering the largest of these caves, the air immediately turned fetid and stale, carrying the unmistakable stench of death and decay. The rocky floor was littered with countless ancient bones, some unmistakably human in origin, while others belonged to various animal species, all in different stages of decomposition and age. A choking aura of malevolence and prehistoric evil seemed to permeate every square inch of the cavern. An almost imperceptible whisper began echoing off the stone walls around us, the sound chilling me to the very core of my being. This place was clearly not meant for scientific observation or data collection. It was a threshold to something that existed far beyond the boundaries of natural law. Without warning, Sarah suddenly screamed in absolute terror. The horrifying sequence of events that followed unfolded with terrifying swiftness. When we turned toward the sound of her voice, she had simply vanished, as if she had never existed at all. Frantic with desperation, we spent hours scouring every square inch of the surrounding forest area, calling her name until our voices became hoarse and raw. There was absolutely no trace of her anywhere, no footprints in the soft earth, no broken foliage marking a path, no torn clothing caught on branches. There was simply no evidence whatsoever that she had ever been with us, just an omnipresent silence that seemed to scream louder than the forest ever had. The following night brought no relief from our mounting terror. My heightened senses seemed to betray me, as I felt unseen eyes constantly watching our every movement from the darkness. Ghostly figures appeared to dance between the trees at the very edge of our vision, vanishing completely whenever I attempted to focus directly on them. The next morning, James reluctantly began sharing traditional tales from local indigenous folklore about wendigos, legendary spirits born from extreme starvation and cannibalistic madness, cursed to stalk the deep forests in endless hunger and supernatural wrath. As a scientist, I had always dismissed such stories as primitive mythology, but the mounting evidence of something beyond natural explanation was systematically eroding every rational theory I could construct. Then came the moment that shattered what remained of our scientific expedition. Marcus disappeared during his routine morning equipment check. His final radio transmission consisted of nothing but fragmented static, punctuated by a single, terror-filled whisper that I will never forget. It knows us. It is coming. Left completely alone in that cursed wilderness, I hastily gathered whatever supplies I could carry and attempted to retrace our original route back to civilization. But I discovered that the familiar paths had mysteriously changed overnight. Trails that had been clearly marked and easily navigable just the previous day were now inexplicably overgrown or had seemingly vanished altogether. I realized with growing horror that we were no longer operating within a realm governed by natural laws, but had become trapped within the boundaries of an ancient curse that defied all rational explanation. My eventual escape from that nightmare was fraught with constant encounters with unseen threats that stalked me just beyond the range of vision. When I finally stumbled into the safety of the ranger station, I had become a mere ghost of the confident scientist who had entered the wilderness weeks earlier. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, spiritually haunted, and forever marked by exposure to secrets that the deep wilderness had kept hidden for centuries. Since returning to civilization, I have devoted the remainder of my career to searching for answers that bridge the gap between rigorous scientific inquiry and respect for the ancient mysteries that stubbornly refuse to be tamed by modern understanding. Some truths carry a burden too heavy for the human mind to bear. Some remote corners of Alaska are meant never to be disturbed by human presence. The echoes of those ancient, malevolent creatures continue to haunt my dreams every night, serving as a constant reminder of the supernatural powers that lurk in the deepest shadows of our planet's last wild places. I share my story today as both a scientific record and a solemn warning to future researchers. When you choose to step into the vast wilderness of Alaska, tread carefully, show proper respect for the old legends passed down through generations, and never forget that there are always unseen eyes watching from the darkness. My name is Captain Jake Morrison, and I come from a long line of fishermen who have made their living from the unforgiving waters of Alaska. My grandfather, Samuel Morrison, started this family tradition back in 1952 when he purchased his first boat with money saved from working in the canneries. My father, Robert Morrison, expanded the operation and passed down to me not just the business, but a deep respect for the ocean and an understanding that the sea gives and takes according to its own mysterious rules. I am what you would call a third-generation commercial fisherman, and I have been captaining fishing vessels in the treacherous waters of the Bering Sea for over 22 years now. The life of a commercial fisherman in Alaska is absolutely brutal. It demands everything from your body, your mind, and sometimes your soul. We face bone, chilling cold that can freeze exposed skin in minutes, monstrous seas that can swallow entire vessels without a trace, and relentless storms that turn the ocean into a churning battlefield between man and nature. The mortality rate in this profession is staggering. Every season, good men disappear beneath the waves, leaving behind families who never get proper closure. But despite all the dangers and hardships, there is nothing quite like the thrill of a successful catch and the deep, almost spiritual connection to the vast ocean that has sustained my family for 3 generations. Fishing in these waters is not just a job or a career choice. It becomes a way of life that gets etched permanently into your soul. I have faced frozen decks where every step could mean a fatal slip into hypothermia, inducing water. I have battled towering waves that rose like liquid mountains above our vessel, threatening to crush us with their tremendous weight. I have endured the near constant threat of frostbite, equipment failures in life, threatening situations, and the psychological toll of months at sea, in some of the most isolated waters on Earth. But nothing in my 2 decades of experience on these dangerous seas could have prepared me for what happened during one particular storm season trip that took place last October. The expedition started exactly like any other routine fishing haul. My crew of 10 experienced fishermen and I had departed from Dutch Harbor on what appeared to be a clear autumn morning, our vessel loaded with equipment and supplies for what we anticipated would be a profitable 3-week expedition. Our objective was to harvest the season's best share of king crab and pollock from the productive fishing grounds deep in the Bering Sea. The air was crisp and invigorating, carrying the familiar scent of salt water and marine life, and the ocean surface sparkled beautifully under the low, hanging Arctic sun. But as we pushed further away from the relative safety of the harbor and into the open ocean, the weather conditions began to take a dramatic and ominous turn for the worse. As we navigated through increasingly choppy open water, my first mate, Pete Rodriguez, a veteran fisherman with 15 years of experience, made his usual jokes about enjoying the calm before the inevitable storm. Pete is the type of man who maintains his sense of humor even in the face of mortal danger, but even he could not hide the growing tension that all of us were beginning to feel. The atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly, and the air itself seemed to be growing heavier and more oppressive with each passing hour. That evening, as the sky darkened prematurely and thick fog began rolling in from the western horizon, the temperature plummeted so sharply that our breath became visible in dense clouds, even inside the heated cabin. By the time we reached our designated fishing area, approximately 60 miles from the nearest land, the thick fog had completely smothered the horizon in an impenetrable wall of ghostly gray mist. The wind howled through our vessel's rigging like a chorus of tormented spirits, and our aging but reliable fishing boat groaned and creaked under the relentless assault of increasingly violent waves. Despite these harsh and dangerous conditions, my experienced crew worked with the practiced precision that comes from years of facing such challenges together, hauling in nets and processing our catch, amidst the constant symphony of mechanical groans and the threatening crash of waves against our hull. It was during one particularly exhausting and difficult net haul, as we fought against both the churning sea and our own physical exhaustion, that we pulled up something that caused even the toughest and most seasoned men on board to stop their work and stare in stunned silence. Entangled within our fishing nets, twisted among the normal catch of fish and crab, was the carcass of a creature that none of us had ever encountered before in all our combined years of commercial fishing. The thing was absolutely massive, measuring at least 10 feet from head to tail, with a body covered in what appeared to be overlapping scales that shimmered with an oily, iridescent quality like wet stone reflecting moonlight. Its powerful limbs ended in gnarled claws that looked capable of tearing through steel, and its elongated skull housed jaws lined with multiple rows of razor-sharp teeth that seemed designed for crushing rather than simply biting. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, which, despite being clouded with death, somehow retained an unsettling appearance of malevolent intelligence, as if this creature had possessed cognitive abilities far beyond those of any known marine animal. The entire deck fell into an eerie silence as we all gathered around this impossible discovery, each man trying to process what we were seeing. Had our nets somehow dredged up some prehistoric sea beast that had been preserved in the icy depths for millions of years? Was this perhaps some previously unknown deep sea species brought to the surface by shifting ocean currents or the gradual melting of underwater ice formations? The wild speculation and nervous theorizing that followed sent ripples of genuine unease through our normally unflappable crew. But the nightmare was only beginning. As we continued to untangle our nets and examine our bizarre catch more closely, we discovered that the creature's remains were intertwined with objects that defied all rational explanation. These were clearly artificial artifacts, crafted with obvious intelligence and purpose, but their design and construction suggested origins far more ancient than any known human civilization. The objects appeared vaguely humanoid in their basic shape and proportions, as if they had been created to represent some form of bipedal beings, but their surfaces were encrusted with layers of barnacles, coral growth, and marine deposits that suggested they had been resting on the ocean floor for countless centuries. Most unsettling of all were the strange markings carved or etched into these artifacts, symbols and patterns that seemed to glow with a faint, otherworldly luminescence when we illuminated them with our powerful deck lights. The symbols were unlike any written language or decorative motifs that any of us had ever seen, yet something about their arrangement and repetition suggested they conveyed specific meaning or purpose to those who understood their significance. From that moment forward, an atmosphere of deep uneasiness settled over our vessel like a suffocating blanket, heavier and more oppressive than any storm cloud we had ever encountered. Our regular radio communications with other fishing vessels in the area began to carry disturbing reports that grew more frequent and more alarming with each passing day. Captains described inexplicable equipment, malfunctions that occurred without warning, the complete disappearance of entire crews from vessels that were later found floating empty and abandoned, and increasingly bizarre sightings of unexplained lights and shadowy figures moving through the fog-covered waters. Word of these strange occurrences traveled with terrifying speed throughout the close-knit community of Bering Sea fishermen. Conversations that had once focused on weather conditions, fish populations, and market prices now turned to hushed whispers about cursed waters and ancient sea spirits that had somehow been awakened and angered by human intrusion into their domain. Our own vessel was far from immune to these supernatural afflictions that seemed to be spreading like a plague throughout the fishing fleet. On our 5th night at sea, during a particularly violent storm that battered us with waves reaching nearly 40 feet in height, a sudden wall of seawater crashed over our deck with tremendous force, carrying with it something that chilled us far more than the freezing temperature of the water itself. Mixed with the roar of wind and waves, we could clearly hear a chorus of whispering voices that seemed to emanate from the very fog that surrounded us, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Many of the men swore they could distinguish individual voices within this supernatural chorus, chanting in rhythmic patterns that were both hypnotic and deeply terrifying. Several crew members claimed to see flickering lights moving beneath the water's surface, pulsing in patterns that seemed to correspond with the otherworldly chanting. When I ordered immediate and thorough searches of both the deck and below deck areas, hoping to find some rational explanation for these phenomena, we found absolutely nothing that could account for what we had all witnessed. Then, like a creeping infection, signs of psychological breakdown began to manifest among my crew members. Initially, the symptoms were relatively subtle. Chronic sleeplessness accompanied by vivid nightmares, increasing irritability and aggression, and reports of glimpsing shadowy figures moving outside the portholes during the darkest hours of night. But as the days progressed, these disturbing behaviors escalated to truly alarming levels that threatened the safety and functionality of our entire operation. Crew members who had previously been reliable and disciplined began openly defying direct orders, engaging in violent physical altercations in the confined quarters, and, worst of all, some would simply vanish from the vessel for hours at a time without explanation. When these missing men eventually returned, they were fundamentally changed, distant, haunted, and speaking in the same unknown tongues we had heard in that supernatural chorus. They would mutter constantly to unseen presences, responding to voices that only they could hear, and their physical movements became jerky and unnatural, as if they were being controlled by some external force. Despite my desperate efforts to maintain order and keep my crew focused on our work and survival, an invisible, malevolent presence seemed to tighten its grip on our vessel with each passing day. Our navigation equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied all mechanical explanation, with compasses spinning wildly and GPS systems providing readings that placed us in impossible locations. Our engines would suddenly howl with mechanical fury before falling completely silent without warning, leaving us drifting helplessly on the increasingly hostile sea. The absolute breaking point came during a night when a tempest of unprecedented fury lashed our vessel with lightning that seemed to claw across the black heavens and mountainous waves that threatened to tear our boat apart piece by piece. As I stood on the bridge, desperately trying to maintain control and coordinate our survival efforts, a tremendous crash echoed up from the lower decks below. Abandoning my post, I rushed down to investigate the source of this new crisis, only to discover that our mainnet storage room had been transformed into something from a nightmare. The walls of the room were completely coated in a thick, black, oily substance that seemed to possess a life of its own, undulating and pulsing with a sinister rhythm that matched no natural phenomenon I had ever witnessed. The substance appeared to be spreading across every surface, consuming everything it touched and leaving behind an otherworldly darkness that hurt to look at directly. Before I could react or retreat, the heavy metal door slammed shut behind me with tremendous force, trapping me inside this nightmarish chamber. The overhead lighting began flickering violently before dying completely, plunging the room into an absolute darkness that was broken only by eerie patches of sickly green luminescence emanating from the spreading black substance. From somewhere within the suffocating gloom, I heard a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the ship. As my eyes adjusted to the hellish environment, I watched in absolute terror as the shadows began to coalesce and solidify into horrifying shapes, twisted, half-human monstrosities covered in scales and marine growth, with elongated limbs ending in razor, sharp claws and eyes that burned with primeval fury and hunger. My heart hammered against my ribs as paralyzing dread threatened to overwhelm me completely. Drawing upon every reserve of strength and determination I possessed, I threw myself against the sealed door, managing through sheer desperation to force it open just enough to squeeze through and escape back to the chaos of the bridge above. Emergency alarms were blaring throughout the ship, and the vessel was rocking so violently that maintaining footing became nearly impossible. The final battle for our survival played out against the backdrop of churning waves and howling wind that seemed determined to drag us all down to join whatever ancient horrors we had awakened from the depths. Flames erupted throughout the crew quarters as the black substance spread like a living plague, consuming everything in its path and transforming our vessel into a floating nightmare. I watched helplessly as men I had worked alongside for years convulsed in supernatural agony, before disappearing entirely, swallowed by the spreading darkness. When dawn finally broke, after what felt like an eternity of horror, our battered vessel was somehow still afloat, though scarred beyond recognition. The few survivors who remained gathered on the blood-stained deck, their faces pale with shock and their voices reduced to trembling whispers. The sea around us had returned to an unnatural stillness, and the fog had lifted to reveal nothing but endless gray horizons stretching in all directions, with no signs of rescue or familiar landmarks. We drifted for 3 more days before a passing cargo freighter spotted our distress signals and brought us back to the safety of Dutch Harbor. By then, we were broken men, our minds fractured by exposure to forces beyond human comprehension, our bodies worn down by supernatural terror, and our souls burdened with knowledge of horrors that lurk beneath the waves. Since that voyage, I have shared the complete truth of what happened with only a handful of people I trust absolutely. The official report filed with the Coast Guard mentioned equipment failures and severe weather conditions, but made no reference to the true cause of our crew losses. However, I know with absolute certainty the chilling truth. Beneath the frozen surface of the Bering Sea dwells something ancient, ravenous, and vengeful, patiently waiting in the abyssal depths for the unwary to venture too far from shore. I continue to make my living from the sea, as fishing is in my blood and the only life I have ever known. But I steer well clear of those cursed fishing grounds, and I have shared warnings with every fisherman who will listen. The ocean guards its darkest secrets jealously, and some catches are far better left unfished, rotting in the depths where they belong. My name is Ashley Williams, but everyone who knows me calls me Ace. I have been flying bush planes across the Alaskan wilderness for over 12 years, and there is not a mountain range, valley, or remote airstrip in this state that I have not navigated at least a dozen times. Flying is not just my profession, it is my passion, my calling, and quite honestly, the only thing I have ever been truly exceptional at in my entire life. When you are piloting a small aircraft through some of the most unforgiving terrain and unpredictable weather conditions on Earth. You learn to trust your instincts, rely on your experience, and never underestimate the power of the wilderness to surprise you. I started flying when I was 16 years old, learning from my uncle, who ran a small charter service out of Anchorage. He taught me that in Alaska, pilots are not just transportation providers. We are lifelines for remote communities, emergency responders when disasters strike, and sometimes the only connection between civilization and the vast emptiness that defines this incredible state. Over the years, I've flown everything from medical evacuations and supply runs to tourists seeking adventure and researchers conducting important scientific work in areas that can only be reached by aircraft. My reputation for reliability and skill has earned me a steady clientele of repeat customers who trust me to get them safely to their destinations, regardless of weather conditions or the remoteness of their final locations. I take pride in my perfect safety record and my ability to land on improvised airstrips that would terrify most pilots. But that confidence, that absolute certainty in my abilities and knowledge of Alaskan airspace, was shattered during what should have been a routine charter flight last September. The job came through my regular booking agent on a Tuesday morning. A family of 4 from Seattle wanted transportation to a remote fishing lodge located approximately 200 miles northeast of Fairbanks. The clients were the Hendersons, David and Patricia, both in their mid-40s, along with their teenage children, Michael and Sarah, who appeared to be around 16 and 14 years old respectively. They seemed like typical tourists, excited about their wilderness adventure and full of questions about the local wildlife and geography. The weather forecast for the day was excellent, with clear skies and minimal wind conditions predicted for the entire route. My aircraft, a reliable Cessna 185 that I have owned and maintained personally for 8 years, was in perfect mechanical condition following a comprehensive inspection just 2 weeks prior. The flight plan was straightforward, a direct road over familiar terrain that I had flown countless times without incident. We departed Fairbanks International Airport at exactly 10:30 in the morning, with an estimated flight time of 1 hour and 45 minutes to reach the remote landing strip adjacent to the fishing lodge. The Henderson family was in high spirits, taking photographs through the cabin windows and marveling at the stunning wilderness scenery unfolding beneath us. Everything proceeded normally for the first hour of flight, as we crossed over the endless expanse of forests, lakes, and mountain ranges that define interior Alaska. But somewhere around the halfway point of our journey, I began to notice subtle discrepancies that initially seemed too minor to be concerning. The landscape below, while still recognizable Alaskan wilderness, appeared slightly different from what I expected to see along this particular route. Mountain peaks seemed positioned at slightly different angles, and lakes that should have been familiar landmarks appeared to have altered shapes or were missing entirely. I attributed these observations to atmospheric conditions or perhaps fatigue affecting my perception and continued following my compass heading and GPS coordinates toward our destination. However, as we progressed further along the route, the discrepancies became more pronounced and impossible to ignore. Rivers were flowing in directions that contradicted my charts, and the entire topographical layout of the terrain seemed to be shifting subtly beneath us. When I checked my instruments, everything appeared to be functioning normally. The compass was steady, the GPS was providing consistent readings, and the engine was running smoothly without any signs of mechanical problems. Yet, something fundamental felt wrong about our location and surroundings in a way that I could not rationally explain. The first truly disturbing indication that something supernatural was occurring came when I glanced back at my passengers to check on their comfort and safety. Mrs. Henderson, who had appeared to be an attractive woman in her mid-40s when we departed Fairbanks, now looked noticeably older. Her hair, which had been predominantly brown with only scattered gray streaks, was now significantly more silver, and fine lines had appeared around her eyes that definitely had not been present at the beginning of our flight. Initially, I convinced myself that the lighting conditions inside the cabin were creating optical illusions, or perhaps I had simply failed to observe her appearance carefully during our pre-flight preparations. But when I looked at her husband and their children, I noticed similar subtle but unmistakable signs of aging. Mr. Henderson's hairline had receded slightly. Their son Michael appeared to have grown taller and developed more mature facial features, and their daughter Sarah looked less like a 14-year-old child and more like a young woman approaching adulthood. My confusion and growing alarm intensified when I realized that, according to my instruments and calculations, we should have reached our destination nearly 30 minutes earlier. Yet, the landscape below showed no signs of the fishing lodge or the distinctive geographical markers that should have indicated our proximity to the landing area. Instead, we seemed to be flying over an endless repetition of the same wilderness terrain. As if we were trapped in some form of geographical loop, I made the decision to contact air traffic control to report our situation and request guidance. But when I attempted to use the radio, I discovered that all communication frequencies were filled with nothing but static. No matter which channel I selected or how I adjusted the equipment, I could not establish contact with any ground stations or other aircraft in the area. As our flight continued beyond what should have been our arrival time, the aging process affecting my passengers accelerated dramatically. Mrs. Henderson's hair became completely white, and deep wrinkles appeared across her face. Mr. Henderson developed a pronounced stoop in his posture and began moving with the careful deliberation of an elderly man. Their children continued growing and maturing at an impossible rate, transforming from teenagers into adults before my eyes. The most horrifying aspect of this supernatural phenomenon was that my passengers seemed completely unaware of the changes occurring to their bodies. They continued chatting cheerfully about their vacation plans and pointing out interesting features in the landscape below, apparently oblivious to the fact that they were aging decades within the span of hours. I checked my own appearance in the small mirror mounted near the instrument panel and was relieved to discover that I appeared unchanged. Whatever force was affecting my passengers seemed to be sparing me from the same fate, though I had no understanding of why I might be immune to its influence. Hours passed, though my instruments indicated that time was progressing normally according to standard measurements. The fuel gauge showed levels that should have been impossible given the duration of our flight, as if the aircraft's consumption rate had somehow been altered along with everything else about our situation. The landscape below continued its endless repetition, showing the same mountains, forests, and lakes in an unchanging pattern that suggested we were somehow flying through the same geographical area repeatedly. No matter what heading I selected, or how drastically I altered our course, the terrain remained stubbornly identical, by what should have been late afternoon according to my departure time calculations. My passengers had aged to the point where they appeared to be elderly individuals, well into their 70s or 80s. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson moved slowly and spoke in the quavering voices of advanced age, while their children had become middle-aged adults with graying hair and mature features. Still, they remained blissfully unaware of their transformation, continuing to behave as if they were the same family that had boarded my aircraft hours earlier. Their conversations became increasingly surreal as they discussed memories and experiences that seemed to span decades beyond what should have been possible given their original ages. The nightmare finally ended as abruptly as it had begun. Without warning or explanation, the familiar landmarks of our intended destination suddenly appeared below us, exactly as they should have according to my original flight plan. The fishing lodge was clearly visible, along with the landing strip that I'd used successfully on numerous previous occasions. As I began my descent toward the airfield, I glanced back at my passengers one final time and nearly lost control of the aircraft in shock. The Henderson family had returned to their original appearances, looking exactly as they had when we departed Fairbanks that morning. There was no trace of the aging process they had undergone, during our supernatural journey, and they showed no awareness that anything unusual had occurred. The landing proceeded without incident, and my passengers disembarked cheerfully, thanking me for what they described as a pleasant and uneventful flight. They showed no memory of the hours of impossible aging or the repetitive landscape that had trapped us in some form of temporal loop. I have never spoken publicly about this experience, knowing that such a story would likely end my career and destroy my reputation as a reliable pilot. However, I have quietly investigated similar reports from other bush pilots, and I have discovered that I am not alone in experiencing these impossible flights through areas where normal rules of time and space seem to be suspended. I continue flying the same routes across Alaska, but I remain constantly vigilant for signs that reality is beginning to bend around me once again. The wilderness holds secrets that defy human understanding, and some destinations exist in dimensions that we are not meant to visit. My name is Tommy Kowalski, and I have been working the oil fields of Alaska for the past 18 years. I am what you would call a roughneck, a blue-collar guy who gets his hands dirty doing the dangerous, back-breaking work that keeps America's energy flowing. I have drilled through permafrost, battled equipment failures in sub-zero temperatures, and worked shifts that would break most men half my age. I pride myself on being tough, reliable, and absolutely fearless when it comes to getting the job done, no matter what obstacles stand in my way. Growing up in a working-class family in Detroit, I learned early that you earn your place in this world through hard work and determination, not through complaints or excuses. My old man worked the auto plants until they shipped the jobs overseas, and he taught me that a real man provides for his family by doing whatever honest work needs to be done. When I was 22 and struggling to make ends meet with a pregnant wife and mounting bills, I heard about the good money being made up in Alaska's oil fields. I packed up everything I owned, kissed my wife goodbye, and headed north to Prudhoe Bay to make my fortune in one of the harshest industrial environments on Earth. The work was brutal from day one, but the pay was better than anything I could have earned back in Detroit. 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero, handling equipment that could crush you or burn you alive if you made one careless mistake, and living in company barracks, surrounded by nothing but frozen tundra for hundreds of miles in every direction. But I adapted quickly, kept my mouth shut, followed orders, and earned a reputation as someone who could be counted on when things got dangerous or complicated. Over the years, I worked my way up from the bottom of the crew hierarchy to become a senior drilling technician, responsible for operating and maintaining some of the most sophisticated and expensive equipment in the oil extraction process. I supervised younger workers, trained newcomers in safety procedures, and took pride in my role as someone the company management could trust with their most critical operations. The Prudhoe Bay oil field is like a small city dropped into the middle of nowhere, with hundreds of workers living and working in conditions that would seem impossible to most people. We had our own power plant, water treatment facility, dining halls, recreation centers, and even a small medical clinic staffed by doctors who specialized in treating industrial injuries. The work never stopped. Operations continued 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather conditions or equipment problems. But despite all the safety training, all the protective equipment, and all the experience accumulated by decades of oil extraction operations, there are some dangers that no amount of preparation can adequately address. Some risks are so far outside the realm of normal industrial hazards that they do not appear in any safety manual or emergency response protocol. The incident that changed everything happened during a routine, deep drilling operation in late March of last year. We were working on extending an existing well to reach newly discovered oil deposits approximately 3,000 feet below the established extraction level. The geological surveys had indicated substantial reserves at that depth, and the company was eager to begin tapping into what could potentially be millions of barrels of high quality crude oil. I was supervising the night shift crew, consisting of 8 experienced workers who had been with the company for an average of 12 years each. We had been drilling steadily for 6 days, making excellent progress through layers of rock and permafrost that had remained undisturbed for thousands of years. The work was proceeding exactly according to plan, with no indication whatsoever that we were about to encounter something that should have remained buried forever. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, as we were preparing to advance the drill bit through another section of particularly dense rock formation, the entire drilling apparatus suddenly lurched violently. The initial assumption was that we had encountered some form of geological instability, or perhaps struck a pocket of pressurized gas that was causing unexpected resistance. However, when we examined the monitoring equipment, all readings appeared normal, with no indication of the type of subsurface conditions that typically cause such equipment malfunctions. Within minutes of the initial disturbance, we began to notice a thick black substance seeping up through the drilling shaft and spreading across the floor of the drilling platform. Initially, we assumed this was simply crude oil reaching the surface earlier than anticipated, which would have been excellent news for production quotas and company profits. Several crew members actually cheered, thinking we had struck a particularly rich deposit that would result in substantial bonuses for everyone involved in the operation. But as the black substance continued flowing from the drill hole, in increasing quantities, it became apparent that this material was unlike any crude oil any of us had ever encountered. The consistency was wrong, too thick and viscous, almost like liquid tar, but with an oily sheen that seemed to shift and move independently of the substance itself. More disturbing was the smell, a putrid odor that combined the worst aspects of rotting organic matter with something sharp and chemical that burned our nostrils and made our eyes water. When one of the younger crew members, a kid named Danny Martinez, who had only been working the fields for about 2 years, accidentally stepped in a puddle of the substance, we got our first indication that we were dealing with something far more dangerous than unconventional crude oil. Danny immediately began screaming and clawing at his boot, trying frantically to remove it as the black material seemed to eat through the thick, rubber sole with alarming speed. We managed to get Danny's boot off before the substance could reach his foot, but when we examined the footwear, we discovered that the black liquid had completely dissolved the rubber and was beginning to work its way through the steel reinforcement in the toe area. Whatever this material was, it possessed corrosive properties that exceeded anything in our hazardous materials training. I immediately ordered the crew to evacuate the drilling platform and called for the emergency response team. But before we could safely retreat from the area, the situation deteriorated rapidly into something that defied all rational explanation. The black substance began spreading across the platform at an impossible rate, flowing uphill against gravity and seeming to move with deliberate purpose, rather than following normal fluid dynamics. More horrifying still, the substance appeared to be seeking out and targeting the crew members who remained in the area. Streams of the black liquid moved like living tentacles, reaching toward workers who were trying to escape and apparently attempting to make contact with human skin or clothing, when a small amount of the material splashed onto the exposed hand of veteran driller Frank Kowalski. No relation to me, despite the shared surname. The results were immediate and nightmarish. Frank's hand began to change color almost instantly, turning from normal flesh tone to a sickly gray, black that matched the substance itself. But more disturbing than the discoloration was the way Frank's expression changed. His face went completely blank, his eyes became unfocused and distant, and he stopped responding to our shouts and attempts to help him. Instead, he began walking deliberately toward the largest concentration of the black substance, moving with jerky, unnatural motions like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. By this time, the emergency alarms were blaring throughout the facility, and additional personnel were arriving to assess the situation and provide assistance. However, the black substance seemed to react aggressively to the presence of more humans, surging upward from the drill hole with renewed force and spreading even more rapidly across the platform and surrounding areas. Within 30 minutes of the initial outbreak, we had lost contact with 6 crew members who had been exposed to varying amounts of the mysterious substance. These men, all of whom I had worked alongside for years and knew to be reliable and mentally stable individuals, had been transformed into something that barely resembled their former selves. They moved in perfect coordination with each other, following some form of shared consciousness or external control that originated from the black material itself. The infected workers showed no recognition of their colleagues or supervisors, did not respond to verbal commands or pleas for communication, and seemed driven by a single-minded purpose to spread the contamination to as many additional people as possible. They would grab at anyone who came within reach, trying to smear the black substance onto exposed skin or force it into the mouths and noses of their intended victims. As the crisis escalated, facility management made the decision to seal off the entire drilling area and implement emergency quarantine procedures. Those of us who had not been directly exposed to the substance were evacuated to a safe distance, while hazardous material specialists attempted to contain the outbreak using protective equipment and chemical neutralizing agents. However, every attempt to stop or neutralize the black substance failed completely. Chemical treatments had no effect whatsoever, and the material seemed to actively resist all containment efforts. Worse still, the infected workers appeared to be gaining strength and coordination as time passed, suggesting that whatever force controlled them was learning and adapting to our defensive measures. The nightmare reached its peak when the infected crew members began working together to sabotage the facility's safety systems and infrastructure. Using their intimate knowledge of the oil field operations, they systematically disabled fire suppression equipment, tampered with power distribution systems, and attempted to breach the containment barriers that were preventing the black substance from spreading to other areas of the complex. I managed to escape the immediate area only by abandoning several co-workers who were calling for help as the infected workers surrounded them. The guilt of leaving those men behind still haunts my dreams, but I knew that staying would have meant becoming another victim rather than being able to warn others about the true nature of what we had unleashed. The official company report classified the incident as an industrial accident caused by equipment failure and exposure to naturally occurring toxic materials. The media was told that a drill bit malfunction had caused the release of hydrogen sulfide gas, resulting in several casualties and the temporary shutdown of drilling operations in that sector. The infected workers were listed as fatalities, and their families received standard death benefits along with legal agreements that prevented them from discussing any details of the incident. But I know the truth about what lies beneath the frozen ground of Alaska's oil fields. Deep underground, in places that have been sealed away from sunlight and human contact for millions of years, ancient forces wait in darkness for the opportunity to reclaim a world they once dominated. Our drilling operations and industrial development are nothing more than pinpricks that occasionally breach the barriers, keeping these entities contained. I no longer work in the oil fields. I moved back to the lower 48 states and found employment in construction work that keeps me safely above ground. But sometimes late at night, I still wake up thinking about those men whose bodies were taken over by that black substance, and I wonder if, somewhere beneath the Alaskan permafrost, they are still down there, waiting for the next group of workers to drill deep enough to set them free. Some things should remain buried forever, and some energy sources are far too dangerous to pursue, regardless of their potential value. My name is Ranger Patricia Davis, but everyone calls me Patty. I have been serving as a park ranger at Glacier Bay National Park and preserve in Alaska for the past 15 years, and during that time, I have conducted over 300 search and rescue operations in some of the most challenging wilderness conditions imaginable. I take pride in my professional approach to law enforcement and emergency response, maintaining detailed incident reports and following established protocols even in the most stressful situations. My record speaks for itself. I have successfully located and extracted 96% of all missing persons cases assigned to me, often under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced wilderness professionals. Glacier Bay covers over 3 million acres of pristine wilderness, containing some of the most spectacular and dangerous terrain in North America. We have active glaciers that can calve without warning, creating tsunamis capable of destroying entire forests. We have mountain ranges where sudden weather changes can trap hikers for days, and vast stretches of trackless wilderness, where even experienced outdoorsmen can become hopelessly lost within hours of leaving established trails. The park receives over 500,000 visitors annually, and a significant percentage of those tourists severely underestimate the risks associated with venturing into true Alaskan wilderness. My background includes extensive training in wilderness survival, emergency medical response, mountain rescue techniques, and law enforcement procedures. I hold certifications from the National Association for Search and Rescue, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I have worked closely with Alaska State Troopers, Coast Guard rescue teams, and military personnel on complex operations that required coordination between multiple agencies and specialized equipment. The incident that fundamentally changed my understanding of what is possible within the boundaries of our national park system began in August of last year when I received an emergency call regarding 4 missing hikers who had failed to return from a planned 3-day backcountry expedition. The missing persons were identified as the Brennan family from Portland, Oregon. Parents Michael and Jennifer, both experienced hikers in their early 40s, along with their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, age 16. According to their filed itinerary, the Brennan family had planned to hike the challenging Fairweather Range trail system, with overnight camping at designated backcountry sites approximately 12 and 24 miles from the trailhead. Their planned return date was August 18th, and when they failed to check out with park headquarters by the required deadline, their emergency contact initiated the missing persons protocol. Weather conditions during their planned hiking period had been generally favorable, with clear skies and moderate temperatures. However, a severe storm system had moved through the area on their scheduled final day, bringing heavy rainfall and significant temperature drops that could have created dangerous conditions for anyone caught in the open without adequate shelter. I organized a comprehensive search operation that included 6 park rangers, 2 Alaska State Trooper investigators, a 4-person volunteer search and rescue team from Juneau, and a helicopter crew from the Coast Guard station at Sitka. We established a command post at the trailhead and began systematic searches along their planned route, focusing initially on areas where hikers most commonly encounter difficulties or become disoriented. The first day of searching produced no physical evidence of the missing family's presence along their intended route. We found no footprints, no camping sign, no discarded equipment, and no indication that they had ever used any of the designated backcountry campsites listed in their itinerary. This was unusual, as even experienced hikers typically leave some trace of their passage that trained searchers can detect and follow. On the second day, our helicopter crew reported spotting what appeared to be a camp approximately 8 miles off the established trail system in an area of extremely difficult terrain that would have required technical climbing skills to access safely. The location was near the base of a glacial formation that had been considered impassable according to our most recent geological surveys. Ground teams required nearly 6 hours to reach the reported location, following unmarked routes through dense forest and across unstable scree fields. When we finally arrived at the coordinates provided by the helicopter crew, we discovered a small campsite that contained equipment and personal belongings clearly belonging to the missing Brennan family. However, the physical evidence at the campsite raised immediate questions that defied logical explanation. The tent was properly erected and appeared to have been occupied recently, but it was positioned in a location that should have been impossible for civilians to reach without specialized mountaineering equipment and extensive rock climbing experience. More puzzling still, the campsite was situated on a narrow ledge approximately 40 feet below the main ridgeline, accessible only by rappelling down a vertical rock face or climbing up from the glacier below. While examining the abandoned campsite, we heard voices calling for help from somewhere above our position. Following the sound, we discovered all 4 members of the Brennan family on a small plateau approximately 200 feet higher up the mountain, in an area that our geological surveys indicated should not exist according to the known topography of the region. The family appeared to be in good physical condition, showing no signs of exposure, dehydration, or serious injury, despite having been missing for over 48 hours in challenging wilderness conditions. However, their behavior and responses to our questions immediately indicated that something was seriously wrong with their mental state or their perception of recent events. When I asked them to explain how they had reached their current location, they provided confused and contradictory accounts that made no logical sense. Michael Brennan insisted that they had been hiking for only a few hours and had never made camp anywhere in the area. Jennifer Brennan claimed they had been lost for several days, but could not explain how they had survived without the food and equipment we had found at the abandoned campsite below. Most disturbing were the accounts provided by the twin Hunan daughters, who appeared to have no memory of each other despite having been traveling together as a family unit. Emma Brennan responded to questions about her sister by asking who we were referring to, while Sophie Brennan seemed genuinely confused by our references to her parents and insisted that she had been hiking alone. During the technical rescue operation required to extract the family from their impossible location, I observed additional anomalies that challenged my understanding of normal human behavior and physical capabilities. Despite being positioned on a narrow ledge that should have terrified anyone with normal survival instincts, none of the family members showed any fear or concern about the dangerous drop-offs surrounding them. They moved casually near precipitous edges that should have triggered immediate panic responses in anyone with functioning self-preservation reflexes. More unsettling still were the physical changes I observed in the family members during the hours-long rescue operation. When we first located them, Michael and Jennifer Brennan had appeared to be in their early 40s, consistent with the ages listed in their missing persons report. However, as we worked to establish secure rappelling lines and safety equipment, both parents seemed to be aging visibly before our eyes. By the time we successfully extracted them from the mountain, they appeared to be in their 60s, with gray hair, wrinkled skin, and the slower movements associated with advanced age. The twin daughters presented an even more confusing situation. Emma Brennan, who had been 16 years old according to park records, now appeared to be a young woman in her 20s. Sophie Brennan, meanwhile, seemed to have aged in reverse, appearing younger than her documented age, and exhibiting the behavior patterns of a child rather than a teenager. When we reached the base camp and I attempted to verify their identities using the photographs from their hiking permits, the images no longer matched the people we had rescued. The photographs showed a typical middle-aged family with teenage daughters, but the individuals in our custody appeared to be elderly parents with adult children of various ages. Medical personnel who examined the family at the park first aid station found them to be in excellent physical health despite their ordeal, but psychological evaluation revealed significant memory gaps and confusion about basic personal information. None of the family members could provide consistent answers about their home address, their occupations, or even their relationships to each other. Most troubling of all, when we contacted the emergency contact number, provided in their original hiking registration, we discovered that no one by the name of Michael or Jennifer Brennan had ever lived at the Portland address listed in their paperwork. The phone number belonged to a family that had never heard of the missing hikers and had no knowledge of any planned trip to Alaska. The official incident report classified the case as a successful search and rescue operation with complications related to altitude sickness and temporary disorientation. The family was transported to Juneau for additional medical evaluation and eventually returned to what they believed was their home in Oregon, despite the lack of any verifiable connection to that location. However, I have continued investigating similar cases throughout my career, and I have discovered a disturbing pattern of missing persons who are found in impossible locations with altered appearances, missing memories, and identities that cannot be verified through normal channels. The wilderness holds secrets that extend far beyond dangerous weather and difficult terrain. Some searches lead to discoveries that challenge everything we think we understand about reality itself. Some rescues bring back people who may not be the same individuals who originally ventured into the wilderness. And some missing persons cases are better left officially closed, regardless of the questions that remain unanswered. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets walk back out of the wilderness wearing familiar faces. My name is Michael Chen Murphy, and I am a professional photographer who has dedicated the past 8 years of my life to capturing the ethereal beauty of the Aurora Borealis in the pristine wilderness of Alaska. Photography is not merely my profession, it is my artistic obsession, my spiritual calling, and the driving force behind every major decision I have made since picking up my first camera during college. I specialize in long exposure night photography, and I have built my entire career around documenting the magnificent light displays that dance across the northern skies during the darkest months of the Alaskan winter. I moved to Fairbanks permanently in 2016 after spending 3 years traveling back and forth from my original home in San Francisco, chasing the perfect aurora photographs that would establish my reputation in the competitive world of nature photography. The northern lights had always fascinated me, ever since I first witnessed them during a college trip to Iceland. But it was not until I experienced the incredible displays visible from interior Alaska that I understood the true artistic potential of aurora photography. The science behind the aurora phenomenon has always been as captivating to me as the visual spectacle itself. When charged particles from the solar wind interact with gases in Earth's upper atmosphere, they create luminescent displays that can stretch across hundreds of miles of sky in patterns that shift and evolve with mesmerizing complexity. No two aurora displays are ever identical, and the infinite variations in color, intensity, and movement provide endless opportunities for creating unique and powerful images. My photographic equipment represents a substantial investment in specialized gear designed specifically for extreme cold weather conditions and extended night photography sessions. I use multiple camera bodies capable of exceptional low light performance, along with a collection of fast, wide-angle lenses that can capture the full scope of aurora displays. My tripods and support systems are engineered to remain stable in high winds and sub-zero temperatures, and I carry backup power systems that can keep my equipment operational through the longest winter nights. Over the years, I have developed relationships with aurora forecasting services, solar activity monitoring stations, and local meteorologists who help me predict the most promising nights for exceptional displays. I have identified dozens of optimal shooting locations throughout the Fairbanks area, each chosen for minimal light pollution, unobstructed northern horizon views, and accessibility during winter conditions. My dedication to aurora photography has earned recognition from National Geographic, Smithsonian Magazine, and several international photography competitions. My images have been featured in calendars, travel guides, and documentary films about the natural wonders of Alaska. More importantly to me, my work has allowed thousands of people who will never have the opportunity to witness the aurora firsthand to experience some small portion of its overwhelming beauty and power. The night that changed everything began like countless others I had spent in pursuit of the perfect aurora photograph. The space weather forecasts were predicting exceptional geomagnetic activity, with the possibility of aurora displays visible as far south as the Canadian border. I had positioned myself at one of my most productive shooting locations, approximately 30 miles northeast of Fairbanks, in an area of rolling hills that provided excellent northern exposure with minimal terrain obstruction. The temperature that evening was minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, well within the range I had learned to manage through years of cold weather photography. I had established my equipment setup by 800 in the evening and settled in for what I anticipated would be a long, but potentially rewarding night of shooting. Initial aurora activity was moderate, producing the typical green curtains and arcs that characterize most northern lights displays. However, as the night progressed, the aurora activity began to intensify far beyond anything I had witnessed during my years of dedicated observation. The typical green luminescence was joined by brilliant reds, purples, and blues that painted the entire northern sky in colors so vivid they seemed almost artificial. The movement patterns became more complex and rapid, with individual curtains of light weaving together in formations that resembled intricate geometric designs rather than the flowing, organic shapes I had come to expect. What struck me as particularly unusual was the way the light patterns seemed to respond to my presence and activities. When I adjusted my camera position or changed lenses, the aurora displays would shift and intensify directly above my location, as if reacting to my movements. When I took photographs, the patterns would pause momentarily, as if posing for the camera, before resuming their complex dance across the sky. Initially, I dismissed these observations as coincidental timing, or perhaps the result of fatigue affecting my perception after hours of intensive concentration. However, as the night continued, the apparent responsiveness of the aurora to my presence became impossible to ignore. The light displays were not merely reacting to my activities, they were anticipating them. When I prepared to photograph a particular formation, the aurora would begin shifting into more photogenic arrangements before I had even finished adjusting my camera settings. When I moved to a different shooting position, the lights would redistribute themselves across the sky to optimize the view for my new location. Most unsettling of all, when I paused to review images on my camera's display screen, the aurora would dim significantly, as if waiting patiently for me to return my attention to the sky. The first direct communication attempt occurred around 2 o'clock in the morning, when the aurora formations began pulsing in regular, rhythmic patterns that bore no resemblance to natural geomagnetic phenomena. The pulses followed mathematical sequences, first simple counting patterns, then prime numbers, then increasingly complex mathematical relationships that demonstrated unmistakable intelligence behind their creation. As I watched in fascination and growing alarm, the pulsing patterns began to synchronize with my heartbeat. I could feel my pulse rate adjusting to match the rhythm of the lights, as if some external force was gradually taking control of my cardiovascular system. The sensation was not painful or immediately threatening, but the realization that something was manipulating my biological functions filled me with a deep sense of dread. The aurora displays continued to evolve throughout the night, developing characteristics that defied every aspect of my understanding of atmospheric physics and electromagnetic phenomena. Individual light formations began maintaining stable shapes for extended periods, creating geometric patterns that remained fixed in position, despite the constant movement of charged particles that should have caused continuous shifting and flowing. More disturbing still, some of these stable formations began to resemble recognizable symbols and characters from various writing systems. I observed what appeared to be mathematical equations, chemical formulas, and even fragments of text in languages I could not identify. The implication was whatever intelligence was controlling these displays possessed knowledge spanning multiple fields of human understanding and possibly extending far beyond our current scientific capabilities. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, the aurora activity reached an intensity level that should have been impossible under natural conditions. The entire sky, from horizon to horizon, was filled with brilliant, multicolored light that cast shadows on the snow-covered landscape below. The temperature of the surrounding air began to rise noticeably, melting frost on my camera equipment and creating localized weather conditions that contradicted everything I knew about aurora-related atmospheric effects. At the peak of this supernatural display, I experienced what I can only describe as direct mental contact with the intelligence behind the lights. Without any audible communication or visual text, complex information began flowing directly into my consciousness. I understood with absolute certainty that I was witnessing a form of communication from entities that existed far beyond the boundaries of Earth's atmosphere. These beings, whatever their nature or origin, had been observing human activities for an extended period and had developed the capability to manipulate electromagnetic phenomena in ways that allowed them to interact directly with our planet's upper atmosphere. The aurora displays I had been photographing were not natural geomagnetic events, but deliberate artistic expressions created specifically for my observation and documentation. The mental contact continued for what felt like hours, but probably lasted only minutes. During this time, I received detailed information about the true nature of space, time, and consciousness that fundamentally altered my understanding of reality itself. I was shown visions of other worlds, other civilizations, and technologies that rendered human scientific achievement insignificant by comparison. When the contact finally ended, and the aurora displays returned to more typical patterns, I found myself fundamentally changed by the experience. My photographs from that night captured images unlike anything in the scientific literature, aurora formations with geometric precision and color combinations that should not exist under natural conditions. I have never publicly discussed the true nature of what occurred that night, knowing that such claims would destroy my professional credibility and potentially result in serious questions about my mental stability. However, I continue my aurora photography work with the knowledge that I am not merely documenting natural phenomena, but potentially facilitating ongoing communication between humanity and intelligences that observe us from the vast darkness of space. The northern lights are no longer just beautiful displays of atmospheric physics to me. They are messages, artwork, and perhaps warnings from entities whose motivations and capabilities remain largely beyond human comprehension. Every night I spend under the aurora-lit sky, I wonder if they are still watching, still communicating, and still deciding what role humanity might play in their incomprehensible cosmic plans. Some photographs capture more than light and shadow. Some images document contact with forces that should remain hidden in the darkness between the stars. My name is Joseph Tikavik, though most folks in my village call me Joe. I am a member of the Inupiaq people, and I have lived my entire life in the remote village of Kaktovik, located on the northern coast of Alaska near the Arctic Circle. For over 40 years, I have followed the traditional ways of subsistence, hunting, that have sustained my family and community for countless generations. My grandfather taught me the ancient skills of tracking, hunting, and reading the signs that nature provides to those who know how to observe and listen. These are not merely survival techniques. They are sacred responsibilities that connect us to our ancestors and to the land that has always provided for our people. Subsistence hunting in the Arctic requires knowledge that cannot be learned from books or acquired through casual observation. You must understand the migration patterns of caribou, the behavioral cycles of seals and whales, and the seasonal movements of every animal that inhabits this harsh but generous landscape. More importantly, you must respect the spiritual aspects of hunting that govern the relationship between humans and the animal spirits that allow themselves to be taken for the survival of our families. My grandfather, Inupiaq, was one of the most respected elders in our community, a man whose wisdom extended far beyond hunting skills to encompass the traditional stories, spiritual practices, and cultural knowledge that define our people's identity. From the time I was old enough to walk on the tundra, he taught me not only the practical aspects of hunting, but also the ancient protocols that ensure harmony between humans and the spirits that inhabit every living creature. Among the most important lessons my grandfather shared with me were the warnings about certain animals that should never be hunted under any circumstances. These were not ordinary creatures, he explained, but beings that possessed intelligence and supernatural abilities far beyond those of natural animals. He called them by names in our traditional language that roughly translate to those who wear false faces, or the mimickers. According to our oldest stories, these entities could take the form of any animal, but they retained human-level intelligence and harbored deep hatred for those who hunted without proper respect and spiritual preparation. The traditional warnings were very specific about how to recognize these dangerous beings. They would display behavior patterns that seemed almost human in their calculation and cunning. They would watch hunters from a distance, learning their habits and preferences. Most dangerous of all, they could perfectly imitate the calls and sounds of genuine animals, using these deceptions to lure hunters into isolated areas where they would become the prey, rather than the predator. My grandfather emphasized repeatedly that these warnings were not mere folklore or primitive superstitions, but practical survival knowledge, passed down through generations of hunters who had encountered these entities and lived to share their experiences with their descendants. He told me that the modern world's dismissal of such traditional knowledge had led to dangerous situations where young hunters, educated in Western schools but ignorant of ancient wisdom, had disappeared or returned from hunting expeditions fundamentally changed by encounters with forces they did not understand. For most of my adult life, I followed my grandfather's teachings faithfully, maintaining the proper spiritual protocols, respecting the traditional hunting seasons and restrictions, and avoiding the specific areas and situations that our ancestral knowledge identified as dangerous. I achieved considerable success as a hunter, providing meat for my family and contributing to the community's food security, while honoring the cultural practices that define our relationship with the land and its inhabitants. However, 3 years ago, pressures from the modern world began to challenge my adherence to traditional restrictions in ways that ultimately led to a confrontation with the very entities my grandfather had warned me about. Throughout my youth, climate change had disrupted many of the traditional migration patterns that our community depended upon for subsistence hunting. Caribou herds were arriving later, and in smaller numbers than historical patterns had predicted. Seal populations were being affected by changes in sea ice formation that made traditional hunting methods less reliable. At the same time, increasing costs for fuel, ammunition, and equipment meant that successful hunting expeditions were becoming more critical for my family's economic survival. During a particularly difficult winter, when our community's meat supplies were running dangerously low, I made the decision to venture into hunting areas that my grandfather had specifically warned me to avoid. These were remote valleys approximately 50 miles inland from our village, accessible only by snowmobile during the coldest months when the ground was frozen solid enough to support vehicular travel. According to traditional knowledge, these valleys were home to entities that our ancestors had learned to avoid through generations of bitter experience. The stories described creatures that appeared to be ordinary caribou or wolves, but possessed supernatural intelligence and the ability to coordinate complex hunting strategies against human prey. Most disturbing of all, these entities could perfectly mimic human voices, using the calls of lost hunters to lure rescuers into traps where they too would disappear without a trace. Despite my lifelong respect for ancestral wisdom, the pressing needs of my family and community convinced me that modern hunting equipment and techniques would provide adequate protection against whatever dangers might exist in these forbidden areas. I rationalized that traditional warnings might have been based on encounters with natural predators that would pose little threat to a hunter armed with high-powered rifles and modern communication equipment. I departed for the Forbidden Valleys on a clear February morning, traveling by snowmobile and carrying enough supplies for a week-long expedition. The journey to the hunting area required 6 hours of travel across increasingly remote and desolate terrain. As I approached the valleys my grandfather had warned me about, I noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere and wildlife behavior that should have served as a clear warning to turn back immediately. The normal sounds of Arctic wildlife, the calls of ravens, the distant howling of wolves, the rustling movements of small mammals, became completely absent as I entered the valley system. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat and breathing with unusual clarity. Even my snowmobile engine seemed muffled and distant, as if the sound was being absorbed by some invisible force that permeated the entire area. More unsettling still was the complete absence of tracks or signs from any animals whatsoever. In normal hunting areas, even during the harshest winter conditions, you can always find evidence of wildlife activity: tracks in the snow, scat deposits, feeding areas where animals have dug through snow to reach vegetation. But these valleys showed no signs that any living creatures had ever inhabited or even passed through the area. On my second day in the Forbidden Territory, I began to notice that I was being observed and followed by entities that maintained their distance but showed unmistakable signs of intelligence and coordination in their surveillance activities. Through my binoculars, I could see what appeared to be caribou positioned on ridges and hilltops surrounding my camping area, but their behavior was completely unlike that of natural animals. These creatures remained motionless for hours at a time, never grazing or moving in the restless patterns typical of caribou herds. They seemed to be positioned strategically to maintain visual contact with my location from multiple directions simultaneously. Most disturbing of all, when I moved to a different location within the valley, the watching animals would relocate in a coordinated fashion to maintain their surveillance network around my new position. On the third night, the entities began attempting direct communication using perfectly replicated human voices. I was awakened around midnight by the sound of my own name being called from somewhere outside my tent. The voice was an exact duplicate of my wife's, complete with her distinctive accent and speech patterns. She was calling for help, claiming to be lost and injured somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. Every instinct developed through 40 years of traditional hunting experience told me that this was exactly the type of deception my grandfather had warned me about, but the emotional impact of hearing my wife's voice in distress was almost overwhelming. I came very close to leaving the safety of my shelter to investigate, and only the specific warnings about voice mimicry that had been drilled into me since childhood prevented me from falling into what was obviously a trap designed to exploit my natural protective instincts. The voice continued calling for help throughout the night, sometimes using my wife's voice, sometimes imitating my children, and occasionally replicating the voices of other community members who would have had no reason to be anywhere near my location. The psychological pressure of ignoring these pleas for help was intense, and I began to understand how hunters who were unfamiliar with traditional warnings could easily be lured away from safety by entities that understood exactly which emotional triggers would be most effective. The final confrontation occurred on my fourth day in the valley, when I decided that the situation had become too dangerous to continue and began preparations to return to my village. As I loaded my equipment onto the snowmobile, I was surrounded by a pack of creatures that had approached my campsite with a coordinated stealth that would have been impossible for natural animals to achieve. What I saw defied every aspect of my understanding of normal wildlife behavior and biology. These entities appeared to be wolves, but they moved with an upright posture and coordinated their actions with obvious intelligence and planning. Their eyes held unmistakable awareness and malice, and when they began to speak using perfectly replicated human voices, I understood that I was facing exactly the type of supernatural predators my ancestors had learned to fear and respect. The entities did not attack immediately, but instead attempted to negotiate, offering to allow my safe departure in exchange for my promise to bring other hunters to their territory in the future. They spoke fluent Inupiaq, demonstrating knowledge of our cultural practices and spiritual beliefs that could only have been acquired through decades or centuries of observing our people. I managed to escape only by invoking traditional spiritual protections that my grandfather had taught me, but that I had never expected to need in actual practice. The old words and ceremonies retained their power, creating barriers that the entities could not cross, and allowing me to reach my snowmobile and begin the journey back to safety. Since returning to my village, I have shared this experience with other hunters and elders, emphasizing the continued relevance of ancestral warnings in our modern world. The traditional knowledge passed down through generations of our people represents survival information that remains as vital today as it was centuries ago. Some boundaries should never be crossed, and some ancient wisdom should never be dismissed. Regardless of the pressures created by changing environmental and economic conditions, the land holds secrets that predate human presence in this region, and some of those secrets are better left undisturbed by those who hunt to survive rather than to conquer. My name is Petty Officer First Class Maria Santos, and I have served as a rescue swimmer with the United States Coast Guard for the past 12 years. I am stationed at Air Station Sitka in southeast Alaska, where our primary mission involves conducting search and rescue operations in some of the most challenging maritime conditions in North America. The waters surrounding the Alexander Archipelago are notorious for sudden weather changes, hidden reefs, and currents that can overwhelm even experienced mariners within minutes of encountering equipment failure or navigation errors. My training as a rescue swimmer required 18 months of intensive physical conditioning, advanced swimming techniques, emergency medical response, and helicopter operations procedures. The selection process eliminates approximately 70% of candidates before they complete basic certification, and ongoing training requirements ensure that only the most capable and dedicated personnel maintain active rescue swimmer status. I take pride in my perfect mission completion record and my reputation for maintaining operational effectiveness under the most extreme conditions imaginable. During my career, I have participated in over 200 successful rescue operations, ranging from routine mechanical assistance calls to complex multi-casualty incidents involving vessels in severe distress. I have extracted survivors from sinking fishing boats, provided medical assistance to injured mariners in remote locations, and coordinated helicopter evacuations under weather conditions that pushed both equipment and personnel to their operational limits. Southeast Alaska presents unique challenges that require constant vigilance and adaptability from rescue personnel. The region's complex geography includes thousands of islands, narrow channels, and hidden passages where vessels can disappear from radar contact without warning. Abandoned facilities from the historical fishing and cannery industries create navigational hazards that are not always accurately marked on current charts. Most significantly, the area's weather patterns can shift from calm conditions to life-threatening storms within hours, stranding mariners who were previously in no apparent danger. The incident that fundamentally altered my understanding of what is possible within the scope of Coast Guard operations began with what appeared to be a routine distress call received at our operations center in October of last year. At approximately 1400 hours, our communications personnel intercepted a Mayday transmission from a commercial fishing vessel identifying itself as the Pacific Dawn, reporting engine failure and taking on water approximately 20 nautical miles southwest of Baranof Island. The initial distress call followed standard maritime emergency protocols, providing vessel identification, crew complement, and precise coordinates for their location. The transmission quality was clear, and the caller's voice indicated stress appropriate to their reported situation, without suggesting panic or immediate life-threatening circumstances. Based on the information provided, this appeared to be a straightforward mechanical assistance case that could be resolved through routine rescue procedures. I was assigned as primary rescue swimmer for the operation, working with a helicopter crew consisting of Pilot Lieutenant Commander James Hartley, co-pilot Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, and Flight Mechanic Petty Officer Second Class David Kim. Our aircraft was a Sikorsky Mech-60 Jayhawk, configured for long-range search and rescue operations, equipped with advanced navigation systems, medical equipment, and rescue hoisting capabilities. Weather conditions at departure were favorable, with clear visibility and moderate winds that posed no significant operational challenges. The flight to the reported distress coordinates required approximately 35 minutes, during which time we maintained radio contact with the Pacific Dawn and received regular updates on their condition and circumstances. Upon reaching the coordinates provided in the initial Mayday call, we immediately located the reported vessel and began standard rescue assessment procedures. The Pacific Dawn appeared to be a commercial fishing boat, approximately 60 feet in length, consistent with vessels commonly operating in southeast Alaska waters. Visual inspection revealed signs of mechanical distress, including visible smoke emanating from the engine compartment and evidence of water accumulation on the main deck. The rescue operation proceeded according to established protocols. I was lowered to the vessel's deck, using the helicopter's rescue hoist, where I was met by 4 crew members who appeared to be in good physical condition despite their vessel's mechanical problems. The crew consisted of Captain Robert McLeod, First Mate Thomas Anderson, and deckhands William Foster and James McCarthy, all of whom provided proper identification and cooperated fully with rescue procedures. However, during the initial medical assessment of the crew members, I began to notice details that seemed inconsistent with their reported circumstances and the general time frame of their distress call. Their clothing, while appropriate for maritime work, appeared to be of an older style than would be expected from contemporary fishermen. More puzzling still, their personal equipment and the vessel's fittings showed signs of age and wear patterns that suggested decades of use rather than normal operational aging. When I questioned Captain MacLeod about the vessel's history and their fishing operations, his responses included references to fishing regulations, market conditions, and geographical landmarks that did not align with current maritime industry standards. He spoke about cannery operations in fishing areas, using terminology that had been obsolete for several decades, and mentioned prices for fish that were inconsistent with current market values. Despite these unusual details, the rescue operation continued without immediate complications. All 4 crew members were successfully hoisted aboard our helicopter, and we began the return flight to Air Station Sitka for standard post-rescue processing and debriefing procedures. The Pacific Dawn was left abandoned at sea pending recovery by commercial salvage operations, as is standard protocol for vessels that cannot be immediately repaired or safely towed. During the return flight, the rescued crew members provided additional information about their circumstances that raised further questions about the accuracy of their accounts. They claimed to have been fishing in areas that had been closed to commercial operations for over 20 years due to conservation concerns. They described encounters with other vessels and personnel who had been confirmed deceased in maritime accidents that occurred decades earlier. Most disturbing of all, when we attempted to verify their identities and vessel registration through standard Coast Guard databases, we discovered no records of the Pacific Dawn or any of the crew members in our current maritime registration systems. The vessel identification numbers provided by Captain MacLeod corresponded to a fishing boat that had been reported lost with all hands in 1987, 15 years before I had even joined the Coast Guard. Upon landing at Air Station Sitka, the rescued crew members were processed through standard post-rescue procedures, including medical evaluation, administrative documentation, and arrangements for temporary accommodation pending resolution of their vessel status. However, within hours of their arrival at our facility, all 4 individuals had simply vanished from the base without explanation or trace. Security cameras showed no record of their departure, and personnel who had been assigned to assist them had no memory of their presence after the initial processing procedures. It was as if they had never existed, despite the detailed documentation of their rescue operation and the physical evidence of our helicopter's fuel consumption and flight time records. 3 weeks later, we received an identical distress call from the same coordinates, using the same vessel identification and crew information. Despite the impossibility of the situation, I was again assigned as primary rescue swimmer for what appeared to be the exact same rescue operation. The Pacific Dawn was found in the identical location and condition, with the same crew members providing the same identification and describing the same mechanical problems in the same terminology. This pattern has repeated itself 4 more times over the past year, with intervals ranging from 2 weeks to several months between incidents. Each rescue operation proceeds identically to the previous ones, with the same crew members, the same vessel condition, and the same unexplained disappearance of rescued personnel upon arrival at our facility. I have attempted to document these anomalous operations through official channels, but my reports are consistently filed and apparently forgotten by administrative personnel who seem to have no memory of previous identical incidents. My crew members show no recollection of having conducted these same rescue operations multiple times, and they treat each occurrence as a routine. First, time emergency response. The most unsettling aspect of these repeated encounters is the gradual realization that I am apparently the only person who retains a memory of the pattern across multiple incidents. During each rescue operation, I recognize the crew members and anticipate their responses to my questions, but they show no recognition of our previous encounters and provide identical information as if meeting me for the first time. I have begun to suspect that these rescue operations represent some form of temporal anomaly or supernatural phenomenon that traps both the Pacific Dawn crew and our rescue personnel in an endless loop of the same emergency scenario. The historical details provided by the rescued crew members suggest that they may be the actual fishermen who were lost in 1987, somehow preserved in a state that allows them to repeatedly experience their final emergency while remaining unaware of the cyclical nature of their situation. The Southeast Alaska waters hold many secrets beneath their deceptively calm surfaces. Some vessels that are reported lost continue to send distress calls across decades, and some rescue operations save the same lives repeatedly without ever achieving a permanent resolution. I continue to respond to these calls because that is my duty as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, but I fear that each identical operation draws me deeper into whatever supernatural force maintains this impossible cycle. Some rescues save lives, while others may condemn the rescuer to join the endless repetition of maritime tragedies that refuse to accept their final resolution. My name is Dr. Edward Blackstone, though most people who know me well call me Eddie. I hold a doctorate in atmospheric physics from the University of Colorado, and for the past 6 years, I have worked as a research meteorologist specializing in Arctic climate patterns and their relationship to global weather systems. I have always been drawn to solitude and intellectual pursuits, preferring the company of books and scientific instruments to the social complexities that most people seem to find essential for their happiness and psychological well-being. The opportunity to serve as winter caretaker for the remote Inupiaq research station in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska represented the perfect convergence of my professional interests and my personal preference for extended periods of isolation. The position required someone with advanced meteorological training who could maintain sophisticated weather monitoring equipment throughout the harsh Arctic winter while simultaneously collecting data that would contribute to our understanding of climate change impacts in the far north. The research station is located approximately 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle, accessible only by small aircraft during the brief summer months when landing conditions permit safe operations on the facility's gravel airstrip. During winter, the station becomes completely isolated from the outside world, with the nearest human settlement over 300 miles away across terrain that becomes impassable once the severe weather begins in earnest. The facility itself consists of several interconnected buildings designed to withstand the extreme conditions that characterize this region during the darkest months of the year. The main research laboratory houses sophisticated meteorological instruments, satellite communication equipment, and computer systems for data analysis and transmission. Adjacent structures include living quarters, a workshop for equipment maintenance, emergency supply storage, and backup power generation systems that ensure continued operation even during the most severe weather events. When I accepted the position, I was fully aware that I would be spending approximately 5 months in complete isolation, with no physical contact with other human beings from early November through late March. The psychological challenges associated with such extended solitude were extensively discussed during my pre-deployment briefing, and I underwent thorough mental health evaluations to ensure my suitability for the assignment. However, I genuinely looked forward to the intellectual freedom that such isolation would provide. I planned to use the long winter months to complete several research papers that had been delayed by teaching responsibilities and administrative duties at the university. I also brought an extensive library of classical literature, philosophy texts, and scientific journals that would provide intellectual stimulation during the periods when weather conditions prevented active data collection activities. The first few weeks of my assignment proceeded exactly as I had anticipated. The daily routine of equipment maintenance, data collection, and analysis provided structure to my days, while the evenings were devoted to reading, writing, and peaceful contemplation of the profound silence that characterizes the Arctic wilderness during winter. The complete absence of artificial light pollution created opportunities for astronomical observation that would be impossible in more populated areas. I found solitude to be deeply restorative, rather than psychologically challenging. The constant noise and social demands of university life had always been sources of stress for me, and the opportunity to live according to my own rhythms without external interruptions felt like a return to my natural state of being. I maintained regular radio contact with my supervisors, submitting data reports and confirming my continued well-being, but these brief communications were the only intrusions on my chosen isolation. However, as the weeks progressed and the Arctic winter deepened, I began to notice subtle anomalies in the facility that gradually challenged my initial contentment with the assignment. These observations were initially so minor that I dismissed them as products of fatigue or the natural settling of buildings under extreme temperature fluctuations. The first indication that something might be wrong came in the form of sounds that seemed to originate from within the walls of the main laboratory building. During the quietest periods of night, when even the wind had stilled and the only audible sounds should have been the mechanical hum of heating systems and scientific equipment, I began to hear what sounded like faint scratching or tapping noises coming from areas where no moving parts should have existed. Initially, I attributed these sounds to the expansion and contraction of building materials under the severe temperature variations that characterize Arctic construction. However, as I listened more carefully over several nights, I began to detect patterns in the sounds that seemed too regular and purposeful to be explained by random structural movements. Scratching sounds occurred primarily during the early morning hours, typically beginning around 3 o'clock and continuing intermittently until dawn. They seemed to move through the walls in deliberate paths, starting from one area of the building and progressing methodically to different locations, as if following predetermined routes through the internal structure. More disturbing still, the sounds began to seem responsive to my presence and activities. When I moved from one room to another, the wall sounds would follow, maintaining their position relative to my location. When I worked late into the night on research projects, the scratching would become more active, as if whatever was causing the disturbance was reacting to my extended periods of wakefulness. My scientific training compelled me to investigate these phenomena systematically rather than simply accepting supernatural explanations. I conducted thorough inspections of the building's interior walls, searching for signs of structural damage, insect infestations, or small mammal intrusions that might account for the mysterious sounds. However, these investigations revealed no obvious explanations for the disturbances. The walls appeared to be in excellent structural condition, with no visible cracks, holes, or other openings that might provide access for animals. The building's construction specifications indicated solid insulation and vapor barriers that should have prevented any form of biological intrusion. Most puzzling of all, the scratching sounds seemed to come from areas within the walls where the building's framework should have made such movements physically impossible. As the winter darkness deepened and my isolation became more complete, the wall sounds evolved from simple scratching and tapping into more complex patterns that increasingly resembled attempts at communication. I began to hear what sounded like Morse code sequences, mathematical patterns, and even rhythmic arrangements that seemed to echo the meter of spoken language. During one particularly unsettling night in late January, I distinctly heard what sounded like my own name being tapped out in Morse code from multiple locations within the walls simultaneously. The precision and coordination of these communications convinced me that I was dealing with an intelligence rather than random natural phenomena. My attempts to respond to these apparent communication attempts produced immediate and dramatic reactions from whatever was living within the building structure. When I tapped back using simple patterns, the wall sounds would pause as if listening, then respond with increasingly complex sequences that demonstrated clear evidence of problem-solving abilities and pattern recognition. The breakthrough in understanding the true nature of my situation came when I discovered a collection of personal journals hidden behind a loose panel in the workshop building. These journals had been written by the previous winter caretakers who had staffed the research station over the past 15 years, documenting experiences that were remarkably similar to my own. The journals revealed that every caretaker who had spent a winter alone at the facility had reported identical phenomena: the progressive development of wall sounds, apparent attempts at communication from within the building's structure, and the gradual realization that they were sharing their isolation with intelligences that should not have existed. Most horrifying of all, the journals indicated that several previous caretakers had simply disappeared during their assignments, with no trace found despite extensive search and rescue operations conducted the following spring. The final entries in these incomplete journals described increasing interactions with the wall dwellers and growing curiosity about their true nature and intentions. The last complete journal, written by Dr. Margaret Henley 3 winters earlier, provided the most detailed account of what she had discovered about the entities living within the research station. According to her observations, the wall dwellers were the preserved consciousnesses of previous caretakers who had become permanently integrated into the facility's structure through some form of supernatural transformation. Henley's final entries described her growing understanding that the isolation and psychological pressure of the assignment created conditions that allowed these trapped consciousnesses to gradually influence and eventually absorb new caretakers into their collective existence. The process was apparently gradual and subtle, beginning with simple communication attempts and progressing through increasing psychological integration until the boundary between the living caretaker and the wall dwellers became completely dissolved. As I read these accounts, I realized that my own experiences were following the exact same progression described by my predecessors. The wall sounds had become more frequent and complex. I was spending increasing amounts of time attempting to communicate with them, and I had begun to feel a growing sense of companionship with these invisible presences that contradicted my initial preference for complete solitude. Most alarmingly, I had begun to lose track of time and to experience periods where I could not account for hours of activity. During these missing periods, I would discover evidence of tasks completed and equipment maintained that I had no memory of performing. The realization that I was gradually losing my individual identity to the collective consciousness trapped within the research station galvanized me into action. Using the emergency communication equipment, I contacted my supervisors and requested immediate extraction, claiming a medical emergency that required urgent evacuation. The rescue flight arrived within 48 hours, battling severe weather conditions to reach the isolated facility. As I prepared to leave, I could hear frantic scratching and tapping from throughout the building, as if the wall dwellers were attempting to prevent my departure or communicate some final message. I have never returned to the Inupiaq research station, and I have recommended that the facility be permanently closed and the buildings demolished. However, I understand that budget constraints and scientific priorities have prevented the implementation of my recommendations, and the station continues to operate with rotating caretaker assignments. Sometimes, during the quietest moments of night, I still hear faint scratching sounds that seem to come from within the walls of whatever building I happen to be occupying. I fear that my exposure to the entities at the research station may have created a permanent connection, one that transcends physical distance, and that I may eventually join the collective consciousness, which continues to expand its influence with each new caretaker who accepts the isolation of that cursed facility. Some forms of solitude are not as empty as they appear, and some companions are better left undiscovered in the darkness between the walls.